Follow me.
So I'm the hermit. I'm living in the cave. The best friend of the hermit is the iPhone. I'm alone but connected to the entire world. Connected to other hermits using also the iPhone. We are really alone without surveillance when we are communicating, for instance, with iMessage, or what is beyond iMessage?
You know, there's always a few different answers, and I think many people have different opinions on it. But for example, with iMessage by design, in the way that it's practically used by nearly everyone, the messages you send get backed up to Apple servers, and they are backed up in a way where Apple can read them and Apple can disclose them. And in fact, in my dissertation for my doctoral research, one of the things that I briefly mention is, in fact, something along these lines about iMessage, what the FBI receives when they ask Apple. This is also separate from what other intelligence services may be able to extract, maybe through lawful or unlawful means. So are you, as an isolated hermit, are you using your iPhone? Are you secure? Are you private? Is it just you and your other hermits that are using iPhones together? I mean, when we ask this question this way, the answer seems pretty clearly no, not if you're worried about the US or anyone with access to Apple's computers, or anyone who's corrupted those people or and somehow, taken control of what they have access to. I mean, you probably wouldn't be. I wouldn't bet my life on it, let's put it that way. Practically speaking, you may recall some of the discussions that Julian and I have had about this topic, where the cost of action sometimes is that you use systems that are not so secure, or that are secure in one way, but not in each way that matters. And the cost of inaction sometimes is more than the cost of insecure action. And so, if one is a hermit and then one takes care to only use iMessage and takes steps to try to ensure that you only talk to people that have disabled the iCloud backups and so on, maybe it's secure. Maybe, but probably you should just know that it's secure enough as long as you're not involved in anything that would matter to someone where they have a large amount of money or a large amount of political will or a large amount of legal authority or political authority. And that's really the way to think about it, which is, who is the hermit worried about? What is the hermit's concern? And I think if we just speak in absolute terms, then of course, almost nothing is as good as just two hermits going for a walk in the forest together, hopefully where neither one of them is wearing a Trophy Corps microphone vest.
Okay, if the other hermit's cave is on the other side of the mountain, then I'm sending an email with Google Mail, with Proton Mail, encrypted, not encrypted. Is this a possibility to avoid surveillance?
Different levels of surveillance. For example, maybe the content of your email is not read if you encrypt it. Probably, unless one of the computers is compromised. Or if you think about privacy in the very literal sense of freedom of association, are you truly freely associating? Well, no. The metadata of the protocols very clearly will link one hermit to another hermit, their from address, their to address. In all of these examples, the servers are not run by you. In theory, you could run your own email server, but in practice, part of the normalization of technology is such that the people that want to communicate can't run the infrastructure anymore. And when you delegate the infrastructure to someone else, they can violate different kinds of privacy at different levels. And so, I don't use Proton Mail, and I don't think it's a very good idea to delegate that, but sometimes it's worth it. I have an email address that's delegated to another service provider, and my university email addresses are always, more and more they delegate these things to, for example, Microsoft for Office 365 or things like this. And as a result, the infrastructure is very slowly kind of moving in a direction of just being a few companies. And then, of course, the companies, as they grow in scale of how many users they host, they have to make compromises with the authorities. So the authorities get automated access in some cases. For example, if you look at Amazon, Amazon has built law enforcement portals where those law enforcement portals just allow someone to self-certify that it's an emergency, and then they get data that maybe would be impossible if you ran the service yourself. Or at least they would have to go to a judge and bring a legal order and then serve it on you. And then if it was stored in your home, which some people actually do host services only in their own home, you'd be in really good legal standing. But in general, most of this stuff is a question of scale. And so, you can, with encryption, sometimes you can at least protect what you're saying, but rarely does it actually protect who is saying something. And it rarely protects the affiliation of any set of people to a group or to a service, or the association between any pair of hermits, for example.
And just using the phone function and just having calls, is this an option?
Well, I think if you're not worried about intelligence services, which a lot of people aren't worried about intelligence services, this is also part of the delegation that happens, the idea that it's good that someone is watching you. This is a transition that's really happened, I think, in a post 9/11 era. I remember being much younger and talking with people about this notion of actually having freedom from being watched. In fact, I remember as a child being told that East Germany, where I now live, of all places, I live in East Berlin, that it wasn't free. And some of the reasons included that the secret services were always watching you. And whether or not that's true, whether or not that's accurate, the impression was generally that if that was happening, it was somehow wrong. It was not the right thing. And in a kind of post 9/11 Western world, we see that America exported its borders, for example, to every shipping yard in the world, where before you can even ship something to America, it clears through customs essentially and is tracked well before it ever arrives in North America. So this kind of securitization has spread out everywhere. And it isn't only America. You see this securitization from different poles of the world. Very large economic trade groups tend to export their kind of sense of borders and security. So what is it that we can really do about that? I mean, as a practical matter. And I think one thing we can recognize is that the shift has occurred. So somehow the secret services really do have access to a lot. So if you pick up the telephone, depending on where you are, 100% of the call is recorded. The content, the metadata, everything. For example, we know this is true for the Bahamas with the National Security Agency monitoring in the Bahamas. There's other countries where that happens. That's part of the NSA program called Mystic. And there's a whole bunch of other programs that are related, like SOML-GET. And the most important detail here is just to know that this is a technological problem that's been solved at the scale of countries. And in some cases, there exist certain circumstances where you make a telephone call and you call someone just across the street. And maybe in certain not as well developed places, that won't be recorded proactively. Or in certain places, the internal state authorities have decided that should only happen in a targeted way. But as things move more and more towards the internet, to voice over IP technologies, then the mass surveillance of the internet means even a regular telephone call is just caught up in the interception. And in fact, the NSA laid out plans, which were detailed in the Snowden archive, very clearly showing how they want to collect all the voice over IP data and have interception points at the voice over IP companies. And there are some maps of this that just show just widespread infrastructure for monitoring. So making a telephone call might be okay. Legally, it's certainly illegal for anybody but the intelligence services to do that. Certainly foreign intelligence services shouldn't be able to do that here to you in Germany, for example. But realistically, the metadata lasts forever. So if you make that call, maybe the content is not kept forever. But in the interest of capitalism, an interesting thing has happened, which is that you get a bill often at the end of the month that says, you called this number for this duration of time, cost you this much. And so there's just a record of every call. And then from that, you can turn that into a social graph. And that graph will show immediately who the hermit calls most often. So you can sort of weigh this graph and say, that hermit is this hermit's favorite hermit.
So from now on, I better ban the iPhone from my night cave where I sleep, because I have no idea what might be recorded during the night. I mean, most of the time I'm alone because this is the destiny of the hermit. But I don't want that. I want to be alone when I'm alone.
I mean, with an iPhone, you're never really alone. For sure. I think one of the natural outcomes of these technological developments, it's just that it has a normalizing effect on people. People know that maybe the things they did were collected by these sensors, and they just become naturally more boring. They just naturally do fewer things. It's really this Bentham panopticon rewritten for the modern era, where we carry our own tracking devices and we know that we're feeding the machine, but there's a trade-off where you can find out when the next bus is, or when the next tram is, or call a taxi, or do your banking online, or something like this. And so people, naturally, they don't get rid of the phone, because all previous things, like a calendar, notes, even the desktop itself where you would write in your calendar, all of that has become a series of apps on a computer. And in this sense, it centralizes all of the distributed activities we used to do with paper, for example, and it adds a lot of convenience and makes it instantaneous, but it puts it all in one spot. And if you don't have that one spot, you really actually become a hermit, whether you're standing in a crowd or not. So part of the discourse about being a hermit is this idea that you're off in the mountains, but in fact, it might be that you're in the middle of a crowd and you're the only person without a cell phone. I mean, you might as well not even exist. So what's the choice? I mean, I think the choice is probably, but I'm not certain, that if you really want to hide who you are and what you're doing, you'll have to have a telephone as well. And then you'll use that telephone, just like every normal person, for everything that's important. And then you'll have to structure into any resistance that you plan, any political action that you plan, that your telephone creates a data story about you where it's plausible. So let's say you want to go to a demonstration, and the demonstration, they need a lot of people, but you don't want to be known as having been there. You just want to be one of the bodies that's holding up a sign. You wear a mask, whatever. You don't have your face shown. You wear gloves so they can't see the vein structures in your hands, so the identity intelligence departments of the world don't have the ability to identify you. But in reality, your phone is still a tracking device, right? It's still going to tell a story about where you were. And if you have someone who's going to go to the grocery store instead of the demonstration, maybe you give them your phone, so that the data trail of your phone shows that you're a compliant and happy citizen who has no protest at all. I mean, one way to look at it also is, in the West, we still haven't really come to understand the consequences. Whereas if you look, for example, in places in the East, I find, especially in the work that I did in China, that there are two things that are true. The first is that the surveillance in China is almost invisible to the untrained eye. To really understand the way all the tracking happens requires a specialization. For non-technical people, it's almost impossible. There's the sense that it's there, but then there's the relaxation of just, aside from cameras, that's it. It's just cameras. But when I speak with Chinese dissidents, they just take for granted that the surveillance is there, and they just take for granted that it will be used to harm them. They're dissidents, after all. They already understand this. They're already being cut out of certain activities. One prominent Chinese dissident that I worked with, had their identification documents taken away. They weren't allowed to travel. They were physically beaten. You see, that too can happen in the West. But it's very difficult for people in the West to connect up the repression with the surveillance, this closing that feedback loop. There's an element of denial. There's an element also of the transfer, where 25 years ago, it would be unthinkable that all your phone calls metadata would be available randomly to an officer of the law or an intelligence person, or that all your bank transfers would be a part of that. In fact, that every bank account you have has to be registered, and so on. Every purchase is electronically instantly available to the bank. I mean, this is an unthinkable thing. And so along with that comes this kind of denial. So for a long time, there was a denial that mass surveillance was happening or that mass data surveillance was happening. And so today, what we see is that there are two camps, those that are in denial still, and those that are cheering it on and happy about it. And so
many people just saying it's not affecting me, so Google can have my data. What they can do is I have nothing to hide. I have nothing to hide is a very important phrase.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true for most boring and mediocre people. I mean, it just goes to show, I mean, I'm a boring and mediocre person. And so I feel like I have nothing to hide either. I feel like what do I do? Most days I go to the grocery store, I come home, I feed my cats, I clean up their litter box. If someone wants to watch that, what do I care? It doesn't matter. I sit, I do academic research, I write some computer software or whatever. And I think to myself, what does it matter? And of course the answer is in a world of algorithmic governance, someone else decides if it matters. And you're in the data set. So if they decide that they don't like what you're doing, they being whoever has access to this data, then perhaps the repression comes to you as a result of this data. In the case of Google, I was once at an event, which I've talked about quite frequently because it sits on my mind quite heavily. A major executive at Google gets up and he says that he's going to use the power of Google in order to find illicit networks. So for example, the one that we can all agree that is bad is the cartels. The cartels are terrible. So they're going to use the power of Google to find the members of the cartel and then kill them. It's like a major Google executive saying that. Now here's the question. Who's doing the killing? And the answer is probably the US and the Mexican governments because they were the other people in the audience. And the idea was that they were saying, we're going to go along with it. We're going to work with you. We're going to help you. So sure, if you're not a cartel member, what does it matter? Well, when the laws change, for example, as they are changing every day, but when they change about things that are actually very close to the heart for regular people, then you see the power of it. So for example, with the overturning of Roe versus Wade in America, Google is very progressive internally as a company with regard to many things except for critiques of capitalism. And so they have like the classic liberal dilemma. The inside of the company has all these people that want to make the world a better place, let's say. And they are now in the uncomfortable position of having a lot of data about people going to visit female reproductive health centers. I mean, what do you think that they will do about that? I mean, they want to collaborate with the states about murdering people without a trial. Do you suppose that it's less or more morally problematic for them to just report you for violating the law? Well, if they think you're a murderer, let's say it's not progressive people. Let's say it's extreme right-wing people that are inside of Google. I'm sure there are many, actually. And let's say that they are the group inside Google that wants to use that data to hunt down people that they perceive as murdering children. Unborn children, but children nonetheless. Well, that data is power. And so maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe you're not in childbearing age. I mean, you're a hermit. You'd probably be perfectly happy if someone else had a child, and you'd be happy if you had a child. You'd maybe be a hermit and leave the child. I don't actually know, but clearly this problem doesn't speak to you as a hermit. But I think it can speak to regular people, which is to show that the possession of the data and the relationship we have to the law and the privatization of the law leads to all sorts of tricky circumstances where the companies don't have to uphold any of your rights. And when they turn over that data at their own discretion, what can you do? You can only suffer. And you can only hope that it doesn't affect you in some way.
But there are two big sources of surveillance and of storing data. This on the one hand, it's state, so in cooperation with the secret services, and the private companies, like you mentioned already, like Meta, Amazon, Facebook, and so on. Yeah. So who's more efficient from your point of view, and what happens when these both data sources are connected to each other? And do we know examples of this that happens actually already?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to look too far to find that these two groups, governments and corporations, are sometimes at odds. So, for example, I expect that you'll see, especially with the split between the East and the West right now with regard to Russia and the Ukraine conflict, probably you can expect that Google is giving up whatever data they can to the West, to the NATO countries. More power to them if that's important to them, right? That's their prerogative to serve their political masters and also to endorse their political goals. So we can see that that's probably happening in many different circumstances. And we know it, from the Snowden archive, we also saw the PRISM program where companies like Google, Apple, PayPal, and so on, they had a explicit collaboration. And the end result was that if the Secret Services wanted data from those companies, they had a way to get it. And there's some dispute about like direct versus indirect access or something like that. But what's important is nobody asserts that there was some kind of like judge sitting in the middle that understood the technological situation and that for every request, a competent third party that was independent reviewed it and analyzed it. In fact, what we saw was that the one court that was involved in that was primarily about protecting only Americans, but realistically only important Americans, not every American. And then it was done in bulk. So the judge would review a thing that would allow for hundreds of thousands of people to be impacted by it, not one at a time. Sometimes it was one at a time, but sometimes it was also bulk. And what that means is it's a little bit of both. And that's kind of everybody. So if we look at the corporations, I think what we can see is, at least with the corporations, you're often not required to interact with them. But for example, with my universities, both of those universities have decided to outsource their internal communication to Microsoft, either as Office 365 or as Microsoft Teams. And what does that mean? It means all the phone calls, all the video calls, all of the emails, all the metadata, all the address books, all the content. It's just sitting on Microsoft servers. And we know that Microsoft collaborates with the Secret Service, often because they simply don't have a choice. So when a corporation has a success in terms of getting that data, the rules can change, whereby the state essentially is able to take that private data, and there's just really nothing that a company can do. That's just how it is. The Secret Services have that data, and then they can do what they want with it. And there's no question that they do all kinds of crazy stuff with that data, that stuff that when you talk about it, people think you're an insane person. So, I mean, really...
This is covered by law, or this is somehow...
Depends. It depends. I mean, it depends on what you mean by the law. For example, we know that, data gets used, and then that data sometimes is known before, say, a terrorist attack happens. Then this terrorist attack being carried out, it's a little bit, I would say, like the Coventry bombing, where the British knew that Coventry would be bombed, but if they revealed it, they would reveal that they'd compromised the Nazi communications. So they let Coventry be bombed, which is an unfortunate fact for all the people that were there, but that's how it is from a strategy perspective. You simply have to do those things from the logic of the Secret Service. And probably this is even true. I don't even need to dispute the Coventry story. I think that it's just a good example. Whether or not it's moral, I guess you'd have to ask the dead. But also, I guess you could ask the living that would have been dead, And I think the same thing is clearly outlined in a number of different documents from the Snowden archive, some of which were covered by ProPublica and the New York Times and others. And in the case of the Mumbai bombings, for example, the NSA had actually compromised the smartphones of the attackers before they attacked the hotel. And they didn't stop the attack. Why? Well, maybe they didn't want to reveal their capabilities. Maybe they didn't notice it in time because it was automated in its collection. Maybe they did notice it and they didn't want to reveal their capabilities. There's a lot of different options there, but ultimately, just because the spying happens, that doesn't mean that the outcome you want will actually occur. The spying does not guarantee good things. So we can see, though, that a lot of terrible things happen from this as well. It's not just terrorist attacks that don't get stopped. They also use it for the drone war. I mean, we have seen thousands of people killed by drones. And a lot of those drones, they use data in order to target people. in order to do what is called positive identification of a target. But there's a lot of room for error, and there's a lot of what we call collateral damage, which is just kind of like a neoliberal way of saying they killed some innocent people. And there's a wonderful book about this called The Language of the Third Reich, which sort of talks about the way that a society encompasses itself in its language. And the language of the Third Reich was such that, you would hear things that sounded banal, but they were actually really terrible. And it wasn't just the Third Reich. You see this also with Stalinism, for example. Like the concept of liquidation, it means something different to us today, but at the time, it was a lot more palatable than saying, kill all of the political enemies, get rid of them, shoot them, whatever, right? As was happening in purges in Russia in that time period or in other places. So I think what we can see is that this surveillance ultimately serves a political master. So when we ask, is there a separation? Which one is worse, the corporation or the state? First of all, what we have to recognize is that if the corporation has the data, then the state, almost certainly a state, will also have the data or can have the data. So there really isn't much once the attention is on the person or on the group. And there isn't much that can practically be done from that frame. But there does exist something which you could think of as almost like the non-aligned movement, which is to say that if you don't use these large corporate services, but you're also not interesting, the eye of Sauron is not yet on you, it may be that you're able to encrypt data between you and other hermits in some very small private clandestine network, which isn't clandestine in the sense that you're even hiding the network. You're just not using all the big services that automatically gather up and log the data. It depends on a lot of factors, but it might be that maybe, at least in that case, until the eye of Sauron is directly on you, the past won't simply be sitting in a database somewhere. I mean, it may sit in a database in a not useful way, like it will be encrypted in some way where even if they break into the computer, they can't decrypt it. This is called forward secrecy. So there exists some opportunities for that, but there's very few systems that are today built at that scale that just work for non-technical people. So there's actually a matter of class privilege that's at play here, which is a class of the literate, the technologically literate. And I mean the absolute peak of technological literacy, people that are writing their own software, that understand the mathematics. Those people have a chance. But for almost everyone else, what's probably the best choice is you have a natural data trail you leave behind all the time. And when things really matter, you leave your phone at home, or you take the microphones out of your phone, or you turn up the music real loud. I mean, we've all seen wonderful movies about the Stasi. So, all these strategies, turning up the music, it doesn't really work very well, to be honest. But things like that are trending in the correct direction.
And returning to the postal service, so to use the technologies of the 18th century and to send letters via horses or whatever, can this be a possibility, or using just the federal postal system? Well,
again, there's always this question of the law, which is to say, another way to look at it is what will be used against you legally versus what is actually happening. That's the distinction we have to draw. And what is actually happening is, in the last 20 years, most postal services in the world, as they modernize, have added a feature that previously would have been considered a crime. And that feature is that you can see the front and back of every letter that's sent. So for a postcard, you can literally get a photograph of both sides of the postcard. And they'll email it to you, or you can visit it on the website. It depends which postal service, but these are services now where you can enable it. Well, obviously, they take a picture of every piece of mail, and whether or not you get to see the picture is if you sign up for it. Now, do they take a picture inside the mail? Well, good question. Probably not. Of course, depending on the envelope that's used, maybe They can see it from the picture itself. If you have a security envelope, maybe not, but maybe the things with security envelopes stand out enough that those get opened. If you're a target of what, for example, in the US is called the mail covers program, then they simply open your mail. They go through your mail, they look at your mail. It's just like all of the classic Stasi films.
So there somewhere exists a huge database with all the pictures of the letters that people send to each other, or let's say when they order something by Amazon and so on.
No, I would say there are many databases. It's much worse. It's not one. It's a lot of databases. And I think...
It's billions of pictures. I mean, this is...
I presume that they have a really good data storage plan. And I mean, who knows? I don't know all the details of it. But for example, with the US Postal Service, you can sign up for this, as I understand it. I've never used this service, but I have read a lot about the mail covers program, and there's postal surveillance going back for ages. You know, there's in Britain, there were scandals about this over 100 years ago. And I mean, this is just, it's part of the history. The same with telegraphs. Wherever there's information, there is interception. Wherever there's interception, there exists the opportunity for interdiction, where things are tampered with or modified in some way. Maybe they're sent onward. Maybe you get fingerprinted, you know, forensics, people lift DNA off of envelopes, you name it. Like, all of these things happen. But what happens at scale now is something that previously, as I said, 20 years ago would have been almost unimaginable. And it seems as a matter of time that, in fact, it'll be a service. I can imagine a service. I'm not a futurist, but I can imagine a service where you mail the letter to someone, and actually the entire letter is scanned and also sent as a PDF first, and then the physical paper arrives later. Or maybe you sign up for archiving it, and then the physical mail never arrives and you only receive the PDF. Currently, there are private companies that do this service, like I think it's called Global Class Mail. And they actually will open it, and it's a high security environment, they claim, and they'll actually send you scans of it. And if you say, oh, I want that, then they'll forward it to your real address. But I can imagine a world where the Postal Service also abuses their monopoly to offer this service for an extra amount of money. Because when you try to run a postal service like a business instead of as a service, you look for all the ways to increase profit. So, you know, if you use the postal system to send postcards, for sure in a lot of countries, there's a picture of both sides of the postcard sitting on a computer somewhere. And if you sign up for it or pay for a service, maybe you get the image.
But it's a good strategy to use dystopia actually for some business plans, and to say we can offer a new service, but we would judge that service is actually part of the contemporary dystopia actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really dystopian. I mean, it's very convenient. You know, you imagine you sign up, let's use the US example where things are really going sideways with abortion these days. It doesn't really matter what people think of abortion. What should matter, though, is thinking about how this was a medical privacy question, medical autonomy question before. And when you start to look at all of the different parts of society and how all of the places we used to have privacy are starting to crumble, it puts data into the hands of people whose traditionally their politics shouldn't have mattered. And now it really does. So let's say that you receive a postcard from a clinic reminding you to come get your checkup. Maybe that's in a photograph in a database. Maybe that's shared with parents who signed up for the mail service to see what mail is coming, and then they see that their daughter, who is 18, but has received this postcard, maybe they see that in the mail before the daughter gets to the mail. They have a digital photograph of it. It's outrageous. And let's say, what if it's the postman or someone in the postal system who's interested in this person? Then they have the photograph. So I'm sure they have lots of security controls internally, but what's important is the strategy of the system itself. You can't really secure that. I mean, that's the problem, is that even if you do secure access to any given image, the security came from the system not being corrupted and recording everything. And now it is corrupted and it records everything. And then maybe you pay an extra fee for some extra features, but the images are there regardless. And so if you look at these kinds of things, one way to look at it is to say, well, it won't affect me. But look to societies that are less free, that have more surveillance. or an equivalent amount of surveillance. And notice that those people will often say it doesn't affect them as part of their strategy for coping, but in private, they will talk about how, in fact, it does impact them and how it harms them. And some of them will have stories about how it's harmed family members. And if you look to, for example, some of the ex-Soviet countries, you can actually see people that have talked about the effects of surveillance. And for a long time, that made people very sympathetic to those people, especially when they would come to the West. You know, like living in a surveillance state was considered simply a bad thing. And this has radically changed now. People imagine that they can think of how the whole system works together, how everybody that's involved in that, they're all good. They're all doing good things. They just want to help. And I think as a hermit, you probably recognize that that might not always be true. It's kind of a naive coping strategy that those people are engaged in. I find it very uncomfortable, but I accept that we lost, right? We lost. There was a period of time in human history where a lot of people were convinced that these were bad things. And now we live in a world where surveillance is being normalized for absolutely every activity, and people are cheering it on.
So would you say that a society which has the possibility of a total surveillance, that is also a totalitarian society?
Well, I mean, by definition, if you have total surveillance, it's totalitarian in the surveillance area. But that doesn't mean it's a totalitarian society. I mean, look at Singapore. I mean, it's sometimes jokingly called Disneyland with the death penalty. I mean, I think their surveillance is pretty high. I mean, you'd like to live in Singapore, right? You'd like to be a hermit in Singapore. You'd have all of the rights afforded to you in that society. Everything's digital. Like, you don't even have to file your taxes. They send you a tax bill. So, I mean, surely that would be fine, right? No problems. I mean, I look at these kinds of things and I think it's difficult to predict the future, but one thing we can say about the present is a lot of people are saying things are fine when it's pretty obviously not fine. I mean, I can give some examples. There's a lot of tension right now about Russia and the Ukraine war. And people are worried that the Russians will come west and invade Germany. And, you know, there's tanks that say like to Berlin written in Russian, in Cyrillic on the tanks. And there's anxiety. Like real anxiety from regular German people about this. And I can somehow understand it. And I think that that's why a little bit, there's just, for some people in the back of their head, they think, oh, what if the Russians were here and they controlled this infrastructure? Their trust might go up if they like the Russians, it might go down if they don't like the Russians. What's interesting, though, is they have to think about that because the systems that we're living in now require us to trust many more people than they used to. And so the question of like, who has this data becomes fundamental. And does that make it a totalitarian society? Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, Germany's a democracy. You have parliamentarians that will talk to the people. You vote for them. You vote them out if they don't do what you want. One question, though, is, will this be used against the political class? And I think the answer to that is yes. Because historically, what happens is that who has the data uses the data. And they use it for their own ends. And because they're often invisible, the people that have the data, that means that it becomes deniable that the data is even being used. So you can imagine that there's probably some deeply religious Catholic person in the CDU, and that person uses Tinder, and they're not out of the closet. Or they use Grindr, and they're not out of the closet. Whoever has that data might be able to blackmail this politician. Imagine that at the scale of the entire population, but for whatever issue is important in their world. And imagine you design a machine learning model around looking at people's lives to figure out which data is hypocritical of them or for their life. I mean, these are technical problems where if you just have the data, you can sort of like imagine making agent-based simulations and then impacting the simulation where you interact with the simulation in some way. And in fact, I had a source that came to me, and I've never talked about it in public, but it's been a long time, so I think it's perfectly fine to talk about it. He said that in Europe, there are people that are using the mass surveillance data to build agent-based simulations. And I said, well, why? And he explained that the agent-based simulations allow them to decide how to interfere, like in a surgical way. So let me give you an example. There's two hermits, and these two hermits, they trust each other, they're friends. Sometimes they meet, but generally they just sit in their caves. The agent-based simulation will look at all the data that they create, everything they do on their phones, on their computers, on the internet, who they call, their credit card receipts, where they get cash out of the ATM, their bank, whatever Bitcoin they use, whatever it is they do, wherever they leave some data behind, wherever they interact with the system in an identifiable way. Now, you use that to predict the day-to-day pattern, the commute of the hermit. Okay, the hermit stays in the cave, they don't go anywhere. Well, probably it's pretty easy to predict that then. You just, every data point points towards they're in the cave. And then you look for ways to get leverage and to get the guy to leave the cave. Or maybe you don't want them to leave the cave because you want to drop a razor blade bomb on them in the case of these terrorists, for example. And so knowing they're in the cave allows you to intervene in a very surgical way. So we know those types of things are happening in active war zones, but I think it's probably also happening in a lot of other places. And part of this is the world of targeted advertising. But part of what this source was telling me, and I think is interesting and worth exploring, is that there's like intentional social engineering that's happening. And what that social engineering looks like is this agent-based simulation of the world where they're like, well, let's drive a car in front of that person when we know they're already stressed out and they have road rage. Let's brake, like stop the car, kind of jerk them around. And then they take the data from that encounter and they feed it into their simulation. They try to make predictions. Will the person go around the car to the right? Will it go around the car to the left? In other words, what they're trying to do with this data, allegedly, is to kind of not only predict the world, but find the most surgical way to change some certain things about the world, to get certain outcomes from the agents in that world. That's a terrifying reality that, until quite recently, wasn't even plausible. I mean, in the last 50 years, this has gone from science fiction to there's probably free software on the internet to help you do most of what I just described. What you need then is the mass surveillance data. And so here it's tied all together. Agent-based simulations are a real thing you can do. They work in certain contexts, like in epidemiology. This is clear to everyone about COVID modeling, for example. It's not perfect. But for example, in countries like Israel, they took the cell phone data and they augmented that. And as a result, their models are different than the models in other countries. And whether they're better, whether they're worse, it's unclear to me. But we see these things are starting to happen at the scale of entire countries based on tracking devices. Now, are there nefarious people that will use that to their own ends? And the answer from my perspective is you'd have to be very naive to believe that they don't exist. And I mean, I've met some of them. In the case of this source, they weren't part of a secret service or something like that, but they were describing that the agent-based simulation wasn't just being done by secret services, but by extremely wealthy people who simply had an interest in controlling the society, that they had some desire to model it for business reasons, not government reasons. Now, whether or not that's true, hard to know. But if you look at large events, we know these kinds of modeling strategies are applied to try to control people in terms of like the flow of people, like the way that water is modeled. And so as agent-based simulations sort of grow in power, when combined with mass surveillance databases, it probably won't be perfectly accurate. But the point is not perfection. The point is to just get closer to what some people in intelligence circles call perfect information. They never arrive at perfect information, but they're always trying to strive to get to the perfect information. And why? Because you make better decisions with perfect information. That's the theory. And it's probably actually quite close to true. The question is, what decisions should they be making at all? And in what area? And so this is the tricky part, is that this mass surveillance data opens that question up in a big way. And it suggests that all the things that are happening in this society that are being in some way recorded or surveilled, that they're in the realm of things that people should be watching and interacting with and maybe modifying or changing. And to me, this is unlike anything we've ever seen in the history of humanity. Is it good? Is it bad? It seems like an experiment where, we're the lab rats. it's a little uncomfortable. And so when I say I think we've lost, I really mean it in a very serious sense, in that we now live in a world where this data is being collected constantly, where data of all types is being collected constantly. Even if you don't carry a cell phone, or don't use a credit card, don't use a bank account, I mean, you're a rare bird as a hermit. But even if you were to do that, you still leave data everywhere. You still interact everywhere. To check into a hotel, you have to have a passport. The passport number is, along with a photocopy of your photograph, is there. And if we think about the concept of private data, a lot of private data is simply data that's held by the government. In other words, it's not secret. It's just not freely available to everyone else, but often it's available to corporations and the state. So it's sort of a joke, actually, if you think about it. There's almost no way to interact in an information society without leaving data behind, even if you're unbanked, even if you don't have a credit card, even if you reject cell phones.
Can you describe the utopia of a free internet? What do you mean is free internet?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's gone. I could tell you about the early internet days, which I grew up with, in that my experience of the early internet is early by today's standards, but I obviously wasn't around in the 70s or 80s on the internet, but in the early 90s, mid 90s. And the utopia of the internet then was that really everything was possible. Everything was open. Everyone would have the ability to communicate with everyone. And that actually still exists in the form of IP networks to some degree. But the applications and protocols that are built on top of that, sometimes they have different political structures and different analysis is required. So maybe the internet allows that, but sometimes the internet is even censored so that you can't directly talk to other people. And ultimately, the idea that everyone could talk to everyone sort of presumed that everyone would have equal knowledge of how to actually use the internet. And what we see is that applications that are built on top of that are actually built for people that don't have this specialized knowledge. And so often that is a kind of consume-oriented angle. However, it is a bidirectional channel. It's just that the channel is often extracting information from you and then sending it back to a centralized place. So, I mean, like if you look at Facebook, it's a great example. Facebook is something that I just could never imagine being adopted in post-war Germany. It's just crazy. Like you report on your neighbors and your friends, you report on your own life, you share it. And the reason is because the value seems to outweigh the social cost, if it were simply summarized like that. But most people, I think they don't think about it like that. It's just replaced a lot of socialization that used to happen. It makes it more convenient. In a way, it makes everyone a physical hermit, in a sense, with regard to the sharing. Because even if you're sharing from your phone in real time, you're somehow like checked out for a moment while you share it. And I don't use Facebook, and I don't think in general that it's very useful, but I think it is just simply a fact that a lot of people do. And so there are, I think, more censors working at companies like Facebook than almost any other job at those companies. What that means is there are more monitors, more people that are, looking at content and viewing it in some way. It's remarkable to me that these companies, not just Facebook, but TikTok or Google or any of the other like really popular services, Twitter is another example. Content moderation is kind of the modern way that people speak about censorship. And people also today often speak about it as a good thing. For example, if someone from Daesh posts a video of someone being beheaded, the content moderator steps in and says this promotes violent extremism and like gets rid of it. In the early days of the internet, you could go to websites and see that kind of stuff if you wanted to, and it was pretty horrible. But it was also a realistic fact about the world. This was the thing that was happening. There were people that were posting it online. I saw some very horrific videos on the internet in the early days, and there were no content moderators at that time. There were simply websites that posted it, and some people who believed the information should be free, and you would make better decisions if you saw it. For example, you might know not to go to a place, or you might decide you do want to go to a place. And so now the modern internet is slowly moving in the direction I would say, of it may get to the point where you will still be surveilling yourself, but there won't really be, in any of the actual applications people use to connect with each other, there won't actually be a lot of space that is unobserved. We live in the sort of golden age of surveillance. And in almost all the services that people use, at some level, whenever there's an intermediary, they are able to do some kind of filtering or censorship. And at different levels, we say that censorship is fine or that content moderation is fine. An example of this with email is that you have spam filtering. And spam filtering notoriously has abuse in that spammers are abusing the mail system, but also the spam, what are called block lists or blacklists, their job is to stop bad things from happening. So if they block lots of things, it makes it very difficult for someone to say, hey, I was blocked and it was wrong, because their communication system is now blocked by this block list. So it's you see that there's a tendency in any system, actually in the internet, that as you move to a system where there are third parties involved or where the general population is involved, there tends to be something that looks like what we call content moderators today. And this happens at almost every level of a protocol analysis of the internet. But at the application layer, if you look at something like Facebook, I mean, there are tens of thousands of people whose whole job is to look at content of messages and look at videos and photographs, decide if it's child pornography or promoting violence or terrorism. For example, there was just an announcement which I read a little differently than other people, I suspect, but is about, Zuckerberg from Facebook and the Biden administration teaming up to ensure that there's no political interference in the next election. And this is kind of laughable in the sense that by having a moderation team, there is always going to be some notion of interference, because unless you have extremely good moderators where everyone has total confidence in them, they will inject their own bias. So the fact that the moderation process is largely secret, and they argue it has to be secret in order to not get gamed by other adversaries, you end up with communications that are no longer free because they're all moderated by a company, and that company doesn't really have any, obligation to your rights. I mean, not in the same way that the state does. And so it's privatizing communication, but without ensuring that your rights are upheld. Now, part of this is that not everybody is said to have equal rights in this system. For example, obviously outsiders interfering with your election, that's obviously a bad thing. And to some degree, I would say that's obviously true. Like when the CIA was messing with South American elections for 50 years, a lot of people said, hey, that's really messed up. And they shouldn't do that. What about Allende? He's a nice guy. He won that election, fair and square. But, people forget about that, and they think to the current era, and they think about the Internet Research Agency in Russia and Donald Trump, and so now people are sort of thinking, let's build this content moderation system at all times because it'll only be used to stop those bad Russians. And my guess is it won't even stop the bad Russians. My guess is what it will do, though, is it will corrupt the entire society and prepare the society for having intermediaries that don't have obligations to uphold their rights. Will they even stop this interference? Well, no. One way they could stop the interference is they could turn it off, the whole system, and allow the process to happen organically outside of the system. But it's not going to happen. That will never happen. So instead, the middle ground is to have these intermediaries. And I think the intentions are probably pretty good. I think people at Facebook don't want, America's democracy to not function. But I think a lot of people in America that don't trust, let's say, Mark Zuckerberg or Facebook, or people that are in California that are sort of like liberal and some that are conservative, they don't view them as a trustworthy, neutral body, right? They're not like a government agency whose job would be to do that. But it's unthinkable for many Americans that we would have a government body of censors like that. You see? So instead of actually having it done in a democratic way where we're honest about the fact that they are censors and that they're moderators and that you do have rights that should be upheld, instead it's outsourced in a neoliberal way where the company takes care of it, but the company doesn't guarantee the rights. And the next election, as a result, a lot of right-wing conservative and other people that I have nothing in common with, basically, those people are already speaking about it as Facebook is fixing the next election for the Biden administration. You see, the problem is not that Facebook is or isn't fixing it. What actually matters is that the perception that it is possible that they can fix it is true. And as a result, that means that the corporation here, in some ways, may in fact be able to shift the election. It may in fact be that the political aspect and the corporate aspect here will allow the state apparatus to be captured in a way that, one way or the other, a large part of the population will find is simply not legitimate. So for me, what's terrible is by going down this path of having these content moderators and censors, which seems like you have to have it if you have an open platform like that, somehow by simply making that choice.
Translate this picture. Is this like a bit to reduce a library so that you say the knowledge of the mankind fits in a library with 5 billion books, and then you say, okay, we take away 2 million books of this, and with this we also reduce the library and we take out some political views from it, so that at the end remains only one story, remains one point of view, remains, let's say, one big conspiracy.
Well,
so
I mean,
take out 5 conspiracies, but one big conspiracy remains at the end. Or
sure, you could easily frame it like that, and I think that that's not unreasonable to frame it that way. But my point, the core of my point is, by choosing to not be free, it's very hard to produce a free society. So that's really the crux of it. By choosing to have these content moderators, choosing to have people that are doing content moderation, to have them in the middle, to have them shadow ban or block or erase things, it's so powerful that it can flip entire elections. And we know that they say if it isn't done, then the election will definitely be flipped. But this is essentially giving up on the idea that the solution to bad speech is more speech. It's giving up on free speech and replacing it with content moderation, aka censorship, censors. Someone who non-transparently, non-democratically, in a corporate context, will now decide if your Facebook post is legitimate or election interference. And for example, what would it mean? You're a German, you're a hermit here in Germany, you have a German passport. If you post on Facebook about the election in America, is that somehow election interference? I mean, in a real democratic society, people impacted by the country's election should also have a say in it. But that's not the way that it actually works, right? Like, I can vote in this election and you can't. So does that mean the things that you say should be somehow hidden from Americans so as to not influence them? I mean, what kind of world is this? I mean, in the last 200 years, actually, the influence of friends and enemies abroad have greatly influenced the results of elections. And this has largely been the purpose of the political process, is in fact to allow people to make that distinction where they freely decide for themselves. And we're moving very quickly away from that world. And I think an alternate would be a world where we can all freely communicate with each other in a way where there simply are no third parties involved, and where people are instead putting out positive messages, and where those positive messages have like a material outcome for the people that are involved. I think that those people will find that they will continue to be influenced in some way by information from lots of places of the world, but without that third party in the middle. And does that mean that someone can run a propaganda campaign that can be damaging to an election or to a particular person? Absolutely. But that requires then that the country teaches media literacy. It requires that people have critical thinking skills. It requires an educated population. And we won't get there overnight, But we won't get there at all if we choose the third-party moderation censorship system and not actually investing in education in order for people to simply be able to think critically about the information they receive and to weigh it and not just have emotional reactions.
So education is the antidote against dystopia?
No, I don't think there is an antidote against dystopia. Luckily, every generation over time dies, and as a result, dystopia shifts over time. So today's utopia would be a dystopia for 4 generations prior, right? My concept of utopia is something that is someone else's nightmare, I'm sure. And so the good news is that on a long enough time frame, I think actually you can look at it either way. What I suspect, though, is that while we are alive, it will be very painful and there will be a lot of suffering and it will be terrible. And some end-to-end encryption might keep you out of the view of these automated systems and using alternate communication systems and conducting your political discourse offline at a Stammtisch somewhere, in some way. But the majority of the population will be swept up in the tides of history, and the tides of history here seem to be, the waves are crashing on the shores of censorship beach and moderation of content beach. And I'm not sure what to do about that, because it's just simply a different way of doing politics where the old values simply they simply cannot connect with the new way of doing things.
You used the term already, and you also said that the internet is controlled by the states, like you named it, Russia now in the conflict with Ukraine, and the war with Ukraine, and by the companies. You used the term already, a non-aligned movement. So what can be a non-aligned movement in the internet? Is such a concept reasonable?
Well, I mean, when I said non-aligned movement earlier, I was only really mentioning that in the context of speaking about East versus West. And I don't think that it makes sense to speak about it really in terms of East versus West or non-aligned. What I would say is there's a question of freedom and autonomy. And I think a lot of people choose convenience over freedom and convenience over autonomy. And I can't blame them. Because until there are viable alternatives, we're stuck in this dystopian hellscape where you get to choose between the Google surveillance monster and the Apple surveillance monster. And then there are some small 2-bit players that maybe they have like a telephone you can use that doesn't immediately log your data to some internet service. But it's very quickly moving to be the case that there's a duopoly in almost every developed part of the world. And there are some options sort of at the long tail, at the bottom of this barrel. And the reality is what we need to see is, for example, the European Union funding a completely free and open hardware device where you control every aspect of this device, where it truly belongs to you, where maybe the updates are made with very specific processes, where you can choose, if you want to delegate certain things, or you can choose not to delegate them, and where there's a way to verify that the things do what they say they're supposed to do. And the problem here is that the state never wants to give up its power. I mean, the classic anarchist critique here has to be said, which is that, why would the state do this? If Apple will help them to do interception, which Apple gives them data and does help them to do interception, why would they want to change that status quo? The centralization, in fact, is beneficial to the state. It is part of what they want. And so I would say that the correct way to think about it is it free software? Is it open source free software, Libre software? Is it open and free hardware? Are the specifications open? Are the standards open? And are the protocols open? Are the platforms standardized in some way? And every time you see something that's proprietary or secret or hidden or something like that, that's on a side where, all bets are off. Your freedom and your privacy, your autonomy are simply not guaranteed. And on the other side, with some kind of free or Libre open source software, it's also not guaranteed there. But the difference is that it would at least be possible that if you had someone you trusted that was technologically sophisticated, they could help you. So imagine you're a parliament, like the German parliament. I mean, every single one of the parliamentarians has a cell phone, and it roughly falls into either iPhone or Android camps. I know a few people in the parliament are kind of like well known for not having that. But what that means is that those companies have the ability potentially to like listen in on every single meeting. How you want to speak about election interference, the technological capabilities of some of these companies. I mean, they can kind of predict what entire governments are thinking about just by looking at the Google search queries. You know, I mean, it's an incredible amount of power. And there's a lot of distraction to speak about the end use in like Facebook, but not to speak about all of the technological devices and platforms and protocols that sit in the middle before you get to Facebook. Or, for example, there's, you know, the possibility that there's targeted malware on devices. Well, when the state is buying the targeted malware and creating a market for it, you know, they're not using that same budget to pressure the companies to stop this from happening. And since almost every country is doing that, that means there's hundreds of countries around the world, effectively, and probably an order of magnitude more agencies of different kinds. They're going to be putting this pressure on these phone companies. And at some point, the phone companies will, the phone manufacturing companies will go the way of the phone companies, which is that they will standardize so-called lawful interception. And if you look at Greece, you see what happens when you do that, which is that the intelligence services target your political opponent. Whoops, who could have predicted that? And of course, like, you know, the difference there is they caught them, but that's because at the time the infrastructure being compromised or the political process being compromised or the intelligence service being compromised is still detectable. When it's happening at scale to everyone's telephones, it's like it starts to become a totally different story. And I think in the next 5 to 10 years, one of the things that we'll see is companies like Apple probably are collaborators in ways that, as of yet, only the most paranoid hermits might predict or imagine. I would like to say one thing before you turn off the camera. If you want to understand the world, you need information. And one of the people who has worked tirelessly, despite massive attacks on his reputation, one of the people that has worked tirelessly to ensure that you, as a person, can look at the information, and thus that journalists can have that information and publish it, is Julian Assange. And he's sitting now in Belmarsh prison, where he faces extradition to the United States of America. And it is a serious thing. He will probably be kept under what are called special administrative measures, though there are claims from the US government that he won't unless he does something to deserve it. His struggle is the struggle of every person to simply know what the facts are and to have the data and to have access to the data. When we speak about what is possible for the future without some semblance of the facts and the truth and access to the original data, there is almost no hope. So the struggle for Julian's freedom is tied with the struggle for all of our freedom. Free Julian Assange.